Hey, Scott.
Hey, Jen.
What are you listening to this week? Welcome to What Are You Listening To? The weekly podcast created to foster community through music by sharing the stories behind the songs that soundtrack our lives. Some of the songs are old, some new, all good. I'm Jenn Tully, and this week I'm joined by Scott Davis. Scott is a multi-instrumentalist, producer, and songwriter based here in Austin, Texas. He started playing in bands in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in the mid-90s, most notably as a member of the Fort Worth alt-country act Would I. He has also played and toured with some of the best musicians in the business, including Carll and the band of Heathens. Scott also released a solo album called Considerate Vandals. We'll learn more about Scott in between the music. Also, did you know that now on Spotify, you can listen to the show with the songs we discuss incorporated? Just search for What Are You Listening To with Music. If you're not listening on Spotify, be sure to give the playlist a listen and then tune into our conversation. With that, let's get started. Scott, what are you listening to this week?
So I've got a couple of songs that have come up. Well, more than a couple, but I had to narrow it down for you.
Right.
So I have a couple of kids, and my youngest, my 6-year-old, has definitely got the music bug, and he was into the soundtrack for Danny Elfman's Nightmare Before Christmas score, and asked me what else Danny Elfman had done, and we ended up working our way all the way back to Oingo Boingo, and so good entrance point for Oingo Boingo, and the song that I've had on repeat this week is Dead Man's Party, off of their 1986 album of the same name. And I was super familiar with Danny Elfman. I was familiar with Oingo Boingo, and I knew the two hits, right? Dead Man's Party, a minor hit,
Yeah.
and then Weird Science, of course, that was in the movie Weird Science. But then when my son wanted me to play him more Oingo Boingo, I played him Dead Man's Party, and he was like hook, line, and sinker. He was all in and wanted me to play him everything. So we've done the Oingo Boingo deep dive, but we keep coming back to Dead Man's Party because it's poppy, but it's also goth and weird, and
Yes.
it checks all the boxes for my 6-year-old for sure, but for me as well.
Well, and I love this because I actually love that you brought a Danny Elfman song. It's funny that you mentioned Nightmare Before Christmas because I was looking back on all the tracks we've had on the show, and I was surprised to see that we hadn't had any Oingo Boingo or Danny Elfman, except we got together, all of the hosts on the Super Awesome Mix Network got together for Christmas, and we all picked our favorite Christmas picks. And Sammer from Super Awesome Mix from that show picked What's This from Nightmare Before Christmas. So we did have a Danny Elfman song in there. But, I kind of love that you picked this for two reasons. One, I love this song. I love Oingo Boingo. I think they're super underrated. And two, I had a similar kind of, I don't know if it's a rule, I'm air quoting here, but with my daughter, when she was little, she's 15 now, but I had like a no kids music deal with her. Like, if you want to listen to something weird, we'll put in Sgt. Pepper's. You want to listen to something silly, we'll put in Oingo Boingo. You want to listen, we never did any Kids Bop or any Wiggles or any of that. I'm like, you're gonna listen to real music because there's enough stuff out there that you can without having to go to like kids music. And so same thing. And I think that it's great that kids can be exposed to stuff like this. And now your 6-year-old is going to carry like Oingo Boingo with them and Danny Elfman. I think it's a great way to perpetuate really good music.
Yeah. I mean, there's no reason to not start them off right,
Right.
I mean, and our son's very different than our daughter. Our daughter's not really into music that much anymore, but when she was really young, I remember her like gazing longingly out the window and singing every word to "Leaving on a Jet Plane."
Oh,
She was into Peter, Paul, and Mary,
so good.
the stuff. But my son is really into specifically British metal and weird new wave.
I love
And
it.
yeah, I mean,
I'm going to have him on the show next.
you should. He could talk more intelligently than a lot of adults about. I mean, he's got an Iron Maiden poster on his wall.
Yes.
He's got a Priest poster, and he has had the Maiden poster since he was 4.
I love it. I love it. And he knows the songs, right? That's always like, as a music fan, like that's my pet peeve when I see a kid, rolling around in a Guns N' Roses shirt. I'm like, tell me one Guns N' Roses song. Like I'm that gal.
Right.
I'm the one that'll like accost the kids and like and that's been our rule with Ivy. Like you don't get to wear a band shirt until you can answer that question.
You can tell me some songs. Yeah. He finally met the threshold for that. He has an Iron Maiden backpack.
Bravo.
He knows enough of the material now. He can wear the Eddie backpack.
Parenting win. Well, I love that you guys shared that same philosophy, and I'm super glad that you brought an Oingo Boingo song, because I think, and I'm super glad that like a whole new generation of people are getting experienced, whether it's because of parenting style choices or whether it's because he's so prolific in the soundtrack world now, obviously with Tim Burton and his movies, but kind of all over, and living in Los Angeles, he's sort of one of those LA fixtures, like you never know where Danny Elfman's going to pop up, and so I kind of have a special place in my heart for him too, just from him being like such an LA institution, from my time living there. But
yeah, it must have been nice having him as a local.
Right. Well, he's just so crazy talented. And like, he's one of those guys that when you're listening to him or interacting, like you can just almost see the wheels turning, like he's got so much happening in his head. It seems like all the time.
Right.
Yeah. Super cool.
I saw a video, an interview clip with him a while back. He was talking about the video for Weird Science and just listening to him talk about how much he hates that video. And you same deal. You could kind of see his wheels turning when they were asking, why do you hate it? And it just like thinking back to, you could see the feelings coming back to him about, well, they made me crawl around a set in a lab coat. I mean, it was just so stupid.
Right. Well, and for somebody that's like that wildly creative, you've got to imagine something that's that sort of, contrived is probably maddening.
Absolutely.
Well, tell me about your second pick. It's definitely a different direction than Oingo Boingo.
Right. So we're coming up on Willie Nelson's 90th birthday here in the next week, and I've played a lot of Willie Nelson songs lately in the last year or so. So I picked what might be my favorite Willie Nelson song, "Last Thing I Needed, First Thing This Morning," which is off the Always on My Mind album, and is actually not written by Willie, but he has
John Parr. Is it a John Parr song? Do I have that right? Gary P. Nunn, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And Willie has Gary's version is great, but Willie's version is, I think it might be a perfect song and a perfect recording.
It's so funny. Like Willie's one of those artists, again, I've mentioned this a lot on the show. My dad's from Texas. My family's from here. Like, I think Willie Nelson is just part of your upbringing when you have a Texas family. And so he's sort of like always been the background music of my life. I always, I know probably every Willie song ever made, but they're kind of like cataloged back there. And so it was funny when you were talking about his 90th birthday. And then we just had what I am assuming is one of Willie's favorite holidays. Just yesterday was 420 for those that observe. And so I think I had that in my head. And when I first saw the title of this song, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be like a wake and bake theme, right? Like this is where we're going. And then when I played it, I was like, And I remembered it was from the Always on My Mind album, which is like was on constant repeat when I was a kid. And then I remembered when I was younger, the reason that I knew this song, or sort of why I connected with this song, was I loved when I was little. It came out in 1976, the Kenny Rogers classic, Find Time to Leave Me Lucille. That's why it's called Lucille, but Find Time to Leave Me Lucille, that song. And I feel like this is kind of like a fresh take on that same theme, right? And so when I was a kid, that's how I connected those dots. Like I'd listened to Lucille so many times, and my parents were like, you cannot play that song again, Jen. Like, we're over the Kenny Rogers. But when I heard this Willie song, I'm like, oh, it's like the same song, except a different story.
I love that you, as a child, were playing these just heart-wrenching songs.
Totally. Totally. I always joke that I want to do like an 80s country music episode where we talk about like all the problematic lyrics that occur in those songs. Like Tight Fitting Jeans comes to mind, and like, like Swingin', and like, I mean, just like hilarious songs where the lyrics were so ridiculous now to listen to them. And like, yes, on some levels problematic, but I was like belting them out, like in the back of the truck, in the car, you name it.
Yeah, that episode would take days.
Wow. Yeah, it would. It would. There were lots of crazy things happening musically and lyrically back then, but it would be a fun episode to do.
Stellar. And I would devote as much time as needed to listen to it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, and speaking of like devoting some time to listen, can we talk about your solo album? Like while we're in kind of the alt country vein or having that conversation, Considerate Vandals, I really love, like you've got so many credits to your name in terms of people that you've played with and worked with and produced for. But I really like your solo album. There's a song on it called Santa Monica Boulevard that is so good. I really like that song.
That talking to friends of mine from LA who have heard that song, it's like, oh yeah, I know where you're talking about that. And that song was written after one night in Los Angeles with a good friend of mine. 2 nights, I guess. We did a 2-night stand at the Troubadour. And
amazing.
Yeah, and so verse 1 is about the bartender who was working that night at the Troubadour.
Yeah.
Second verse, we went down the street to the Rainbow Room and ran into Ron Jeremy. So Ron Jeremy is the guy in the second verse. And then third verse is the male prostitutes that we ran into on Santa Monica Boulevard that night. And kind of, so, some kind of I don't know exactly what I was going for there, but the words that popped into my head at the time made sounded good to me, and so it kind of came together. It was one of those songs that it just poured out in about 15 or 20 minutes.
Wow, that's so amazing to me. Anytime I hear artists say that, because it just seems like such a daunting process to me, who's a music lover but not a musician. So when I hear people say like, oh yeah, I just wrote it out in 5 minutes, or like the music came to me in a dream and I woke up and recorded it or whatever, I always just find that so amazing. And I feel like you can kind of tell, like you said, for somebody that's lived in Los Angeles, hearing that song and recognizing, in some ways the places you were talking about. Now I hadn't pinpointed everything exactly until you just shared what each verse is about, but it definitely created the feeling and made me very, it definitely sent memories of Los Angeles into my brain immediately. So definitely check out. I'll call out at the end how folks can listen to the album. But Considerate Vandals. I also like the title of the album. But the whole thing is good from beginning to end. Santa Monica Boulevard was a standout track. And so I had to chat with you about that one.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank
you. Well, as we transition then into, we're going to step out of the country zone for a minute, and we're going to go all the way back to 1966 with my first pick, which is an amazing song called "Got to Get You Into My Life" by the Beatles. So
yes.
I love this song. I'm not sure there's a whole lot that I can say about the Beatles that hasn't already been said over the last 60 years. But what made me think of this song and sort of why it came to mind was the conversation we had about Dead Man's Party. My daughter listened to only adult or regular music, no kids music when she was little, and she loved the Beatles. That was one that we found early. So she kind of, we started maybe with Sgt. Pepper's, or even we might have started with Yellow Submarine. And she just went deep into the Beatles catalog. And Revolver is my favorite Beatles album.
Yes.
And so this song was just the one. This was her Dead Man's Party. Like anytime we put the Beatles on, she wanted to hear Got to Get You Into My Life. She loved this song. And I feel like it's such a happy song, right? You almost have to smile listening to it. It's instantly recognizable. The horns in the song are for sure a standout for me. And just, this album, there are so many good songs on Revolver. She Said, Good Day Sunshine, Taxman, Here, There, and Everywhere. Like some of my favorite Beatles songs are on this album. So there's just, again, it's hard to talk about Beatles tracks because everybody's said everything. They're genius. End of story.
Story. I saw, a couple of things. I saw some, I don't remember where I saw it. This was years ago, but somebody wrote, Bing Crosby was threatened by Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was threatened by Elvis. Elvis was threatened by the Beatles, and nobody's threatened the Beatles in 50 years. Right. I mean, they kind of set a bar that has not been topped by anybody. I mean, you could make some arguments that people have gotten close, but I don't know that it's ever been topped. I mean, like as for the creative arrangements, creative producing, the songwriting, it was a whole package, and it's kind of been the standard bearer for all pretty much all of rock and roll history at this point. And I mean, really, how can you top that?
Well, and just their ability to evolve and change too, right? Like you could make a case for great bands like Led Zeppelin, and Led Zeppelin, who I love. Anybody that knows me or has listened to the show once knows I'm a huge Zeppelin fan. I'm certainly not disparaging them, but from Led Zeppelin 1 until In Through the Outdoor, it's Led Zeppelin, right? Like it kind of sounds like Led Zeppelin. With the Beatles, you can hear their evolution from something like Michelle to Tomorrow Never Knows. Like you're getting like really, you're getting these creative artists that are top of their game, that are also not afraid to like grow and change and evolve and create the new sounds of the future. And that's why I feel like they're so untouched.
And all that evolution occurred in like 6 years.
Yeah.
I mean, from Meet the Beatles to Let It Be, I mean, you're talking about what, eight years altogether. The band only existed for 10, not even 10, I think 9 years. And I mean, when you listen to the early material and then compare it to the stuff they were doing right there at the end, it's light years different.
Totally. And so that's where I think that they're so untouchable, and the Beatles will always hold a place in music history for so many reasons, and that just being one of them. And when go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I also have to say, I'm surprised that what led you to pick this song was the kids, because I thought this was maybe the tie-in to 420, because it's an ode to marijuana.
Oh, I did not know that, which is interesting. Well, I thought you were going to say that you thought that the reason I had picked this song was because of our mutual friends, Don and Sylvia. You guys all know Don Cento. He's a regular on the show here. His wife, Sylvia, who we reference a lot, is a huge Beatles fan. And I credit Sylvia with really she's the one that really made me fall in love with the Revolver album. It was one of her favorites when we were in college, and like just listening to it with her, I always think of Sylvia when I hear the album. But yeah, she's kind of the one that brought that album into the special place in my heart that it holds.
so many common threads here.
So many. Well, and here comes our final common thread, our big finish, if you will, Scott. My second pick of today or this week is Dreams by Van Halen. Now,
Yes.
I invited you on the show for a whole lot of reasons, and one of them, and maybe not the least of them, being that you hold the spot as being the first male in the history of me having the conversation about Van Halen that is on the same page with me about Van Halen versus Van Hagar. I always find myself, we talked about this, whenever I first met you, and I find myself in this conversation with dudes who are just really like hell bent on the fact that Van Halen does not exist unless David Lee Roth is the lead singer. And I love David Lee Roth. Do not get me wrong. He is an amazing entertainer, one of the best frontmen ever. Love it. And I think Sammy Hagar is fantastic too. And so I was so happy to hear you say like, yeah. And you said the magic words to me, which are, Van Halen is Eddie Van Halen. And I'm like, yes, that's what I always say. Van Halen is Eddie Van Halen. It's not about David Lee Roth. It's not about Sammy Hagar. They were lucky that they had these two great frontmen, very different frontmen. But Van Halen to me, and the magic of Van Halen, is Eddie Van Halen.
Is Eddie Van Halen. And
right.
the spirit and the life of like you listen. So yesterday I listened to 1984 and 5150 back to back.
Okay.
And I hadn't had this conversation. Well, I've had the conversation plenty of times, but I hadn't really dug into, why I feel that way, or even like to harken back to, the mid 80s when I heard this happening in real time, why I was able to float straight into Van Hagar without really missing a beat. And the records do sound a lot different. They made some other changes in production styles, like they used it. That was their first record without Ted Templeman producing, and if the guitar, Eddie's guitar even sounds kind of sonically different, but it is still the star of the show. Even with all the people forget this about Eddie Van Halen. He was also a great synth player. And that he did a lot of synth work on 1984. Yeah. Really did a lot on 5150, and that especially on the hits. Like we're talking about Dreams here. Like the keyboards are as big a star as the guitar work, and so the stylistically they made some changes, but it's still like it's not just Eddie. Like you talk about Eddie Van Halen's one of those guitar players, even after his sound had changed, like you can hear one note and know that it's Eddie Van Halen.
Yes.
Like with the first time you heard Beat It by Michael Jackson, you knew that was Eddie playing the guitar solo. But not just Eddie, Alex Van Halen, like he's one of the drummers you can hear like, that's Alex Van Halen.
Yes.
Like he has a sound, he has a style. And Michael Anthony, I'm going to throw it out, one of the best high harmony singers of all time.
Agreed.
And a totally underrated bass player. Like, yeah, he was pumping straight eights for a lot of that stuff, and that's why that felt so good. But you listen to some of the fills, some of the melodic choices, he's an excellent bass player. And so the core essence of the band was still there. The spirit of the songs was still there. I've heard people in this conversation say that, Sammy Hagar was not as good a songwriter as David Lee Roth. And you're splitting hairs here. This was not like lyrically deep material.
Right.
This was like everything was pretty squarely tongue in cheek. Even the love songs on 50 are, I was in my very early adolescence when that record came out, and I feel like that record was marketed to me. And, the silly songs, the first track on that record is good enough.
Good enough, yeah.
He channels the Big Bopper there right out of the gate, and then the song. It's a song comparing women to steak.
Yeah.
It's not heady material. This is really really lowbrow stuff. tongue in cheek, just fun rock and roll. And the love songs are, were my 12-year-old idea of what falling in love should feel like. I mean, like love.
Totally.
I remember listening to that song on repeat when I was wallowing in my sadness about not knowing how to ask a girl out when I was, 14 years old.
Yeah, and I feel like anybody that kind of grew up in that time frame, like, yes, you like, I love 1984 as much as the next guy, and I also love 5150, right? And you can't get away from the hits on that album. Aside from Dreams, Why Can't This Be Love, Summer Nights, Best of Both Worlds, Love Walks In, and like not the funny story, but when we talk about songs that soundtrack our lives. Dreams popped up not only because we had the Van Halen Van Hagar conversation, but Dreams was actually a song that I played at my wedding.
Right.
We instead of like walking out to the wedding march after they introduced my husband and I, they make a big thing about, and now let me be the first to introduce you to Mr. and Mrs., da 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 da. Instead of like the dun 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 dun, like we turned around and they immediately played Dreams by Van Halen, and we were married outside, and everybody was just like, brah! Like the whole place. The song's immediately recognizable. Anytime you hear Van Halen, to me that says, oh, summer party, like it's time to go, right? So everybody knew, like, okay, the boring part's over, like now it's time to party. It was actually the perfect wedding song. I've been encouraging people for the last 25 years to check out, don't overlook Van Halen for your wedding music.
Use it. And the only way you could have topped that as your walk-off music is if the Blue Angels did a flyby.
Right. Totally.
I mean, can you imagine like grown men crying on their tuxedos?
Oh yeah, it would have happened. My husband, we would have had to like pick him up off the floor. He would have died.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, we've talked about lots of different music here from like 1966 all the way up until the 80s. So I know that, like, again, you've produced and played and recorded with like all kinds of people, the Trishas and Rob Baird and Hayes Carll. And you've also worked with artists like Kid Rock and Black Pumas. Like, is it challenging to switch between genres like that? Do you have a favorite, or is it just like you are musically inclined and so the genre really doesn't matter? It's just great music to you.
Yeah, the last thing you said, I think, is the most accurate. I mean, and there are certainly some genres that I cannot slide. I mean, I would never in a million years claim to even be able to fake my way through jazz. Like I love jazz, but I'm completely self-taught. I am a very untrained musician. So it's not something I can, that's not a genre that I can fall into, but any of the genres across the pop world. I'm a music fan and a music listener, and I have drifted between so many genres as a listener through my life that it all feels pretty familiar. Even if I'm sliding into something that I maybe stylistically haven't played a lot of, I feel like my ear seems to naturally know where to go because I've heard it enough. So
that.
Yeah, it's not that different to go from I'll do gigs that are like one day I'll be playing traditional honky tonk, and then the next day this last week's an example. I did a country session, and then the very next day I did a session where the track sounded like a mid 80s Madonna song,
Wow.
And they were both so much fun, and it was really easy to just fall in. So I think it just comes from being a music listener. I was, my parents didn't really listen to music, but I discovered MTV when I was 6 years old, and my parents bought a second TV set in like 1982, and they made the mistake of putting it in the upstairs room next door to my bedroom. So I would wait for them to fall asleep, and then I'd sneak into the next door room and watch MTV until I fell asleep.
Yeah, same. It was so funny too to have like the MTV conversation with folks that grew up with MTV when it was still legitimately music television and only played videos because it's so different now. But I love that. I'm so glad that you agreed to do the show. Thank you so much for coming on. Your experience is so vast, and I love having conversations with musicians because, again, I find them just what you do is like magic to me, right? Like somebody that's a music fan but has zero musical talent. It feels like magic, and I'm so grateful that that you and other musicians continue to produce it for people like me that are true music fans and don't know what they would do without it. So
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
I'm so glad you were available. So thank you for sharing what you're listening to this week. And to learn more about Scott and listen to some of his music, especially that Considerate Vandals album that I mentioned earlier, you can visit his website at www.vivascottdavis.com. That's VIVASCOTTDAVIS.com. And please be sure to follow, download, and share this episode with everyone you know and all the people you'd like to know, because music is a great way to connect. Last but not least, to stay informed on all things Super Awesome Mix and what are you listening to, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Super Awesome Mix. Thanks for listening, and please join me again next week to find your new favorite song.